Welcome to the Daily Tech News Show Weekend Edition, gratefully provided to you, and thanks for your support of this show. And this weekend, we're going to talk data centers. Now, I know we've done that before, where I went through some of the things to know about a data center if you're a person who is interested in them and coming to your communities. So to kind of follow up on that, and some people asked us to do this, Craig Porter has agreed to join us and talk a little bit about what life is like inside a data center, because you may know Craig as the guy who worked in Antarctica. He's no longer in Antarctica, but he has worked in data centers multiple times throughout his career. So Craig, thank you for joining us and sharing some of your insight with us.
Yeah, it's great to be here, Tom. And, I'm happy to talk about this topic. There's a lot of, I think, misinformation out there, on both sides, I think.
Yeah.
And, I think that giving people a clear picture of what's actually going on will help people make decisions as to, what they want to do in their communities.
Yeah, and then it's not just, I kind of trust Tom to do some decent research. It's Craig actually put his hand on this sort of situation. So let's start there. We're not presenting you as the world's foremost expert on data centers. This is more of a hey, Craig has worked at these places and can tell us a little bit about what goes on there. What is your experience with data centers?
Yeah, so for people who may not remember, I spent 12 and a half years in the Navy as a nuclear reactor operator, and then I got out of the Navy and I worked at Google for 4 years at the data centers in Iowa, and it's a very relatively easy transition for ex-nuclear people from the Navy to go into the data center world because it's called it's mission critical. If the equipment goes down, then you have procedures that you have to follow step by step in order to rectify the situation and things like that. So it was a natural transition. I was at Google for about 4 years. And, due to circumstances, moved up to Portland, Oregon and worked in electrical equipment installation. And then I went back into data centers, worked for a couple different companies for about a six-month period up there in Portland. I left those, kind of moved around with my career, went to Antarctica for 8 months, and ended up moving here to Vegas. And my previous company that I just left last week was doing data center commissioning for the big switch facilities down here in Vegas. So what commissioning is, it's not just data center specific, but in regards to data centers, it's making sure that the electrical switchgear works correctly, making sure that equipment is installed correctly, that it operates by itself correctly, and then it operates as a combined integrated facility all correctly, and everything responds as it should and things like that. So that's kind of my data center background. As you said, I'm not, a design engineer. I'm not, the guy who creates these designs from scratch or anything, but I've certainly had input into how things should be built and how things, if it's not working correctly, what are the ways to rectify that and things of that nature. So
yeah, and I think for most people listening, it will be interesting to just hear what it's like, unless there's somebody who already works inside of a data center, in which case they're just going to want to compare notes, right? They're going to be nodding along with you.
And I'd imagine in the DTNS audience, there's quite a few.
There are
quite a few data center engineers out there.
Indeed, but for those who don't know, what is it like generally inside of a data center? Because I imagine there's all kinds of conceptions if someone has never been to one, whirring fans and smoke and spouting plumes of water. So who knows what people imagine? What's it really like?
Yeah, well, hopefully neither of those last two, because that means something's going catastrophically wrong. I will say, for kind of more in depth, Google does a pretty good job of giving a overview of their data center facilities on their website. I don't remember the website off the top of my head, but if you kind of want to have visuals, and they have video walkthroughs, I think. But in general, a data center is a big warehouse in most cases. Instead of having crates or boxes or packages or things like that, Yeah, and I think this is it. So, yeah, it's essentially a big warehouse, but instead of boxes and you know material handling equipment, you have computers. You have servers, and basically, what a server is, it's just a computer that's optimized for processing a lot of requests and storing data and things of that nature. Not like your laptop. These computers are in racks. There's not monitors, there's not keyboards or anything like that. It's all operated remotely for the most part. Some some server racks, you can plug in a KVM, which is a keyboard, monitor, and mouse. But most of the hyperscale data centers that I've been at, you don't have that capability. It's all operated remotely a by a networking team or SRE team or people like that. They're usually not on site. The people who are on site are usually electricians, HVAC specialists, a lot of trade related personnel. Not as many of the you know like because that's operations. And so there's kind of two types of operations. You have facilities operations, which makes sure that the power and the cooling keeps going. And then you have network operations, which controls all of the servers and things like that. So, and you're seeing on the screen kind of in general what Google has going on in their data centers. So,
and if you're listening, as I know most of you are, you can go to datacenters.google and then press play on the video, and then you'll see it on the screen too.
yeah. And like I said, Google is but one data center company out there. You think of your big, tech companies. You have Google, you have Meta, X,
Microsoft.
Microsoft. Yeah, of course, Microsoft. How can I forget about that?
Amazon.
So those are your big, and Amazon. Yeah, so those are your big ones. But then you also have smaller companies like Switch, Stream, Aligned, companies like that. They're smaller, and they can have all different kinds of customers. From your local municipal law enforcement. Like one of the data centers I worked at in Oregon, they had like the IT infrastructure for the local law enforcement, or like automotive companies. They don't want to maintain all that infrastructure, so they co-locate. That's what it's called. They basically build all this infrastructure and then they rent it out to people. And a lot of the big, hyperscale tech companies, they also rent out space too, because in addition to building these huge data centers, they still need capacity to kind of hold them over until these big facilities are built. So they'll, contract out with the smaller companies to co-locate, or, in the case of Switch, they might just, buy out a whole data center and have Switch build and operate it. But then the they're called the resident or the client, they have everything inside of that facility. So.
Yeah, there's so many industries like that. And I think it's funny that we all understand that our own industry has those kinds of interrelationships, but we forget when we think of others. So I think most people think, well, Microsoft has its data centers and Amazon has its data centers and Google has its data centers. But of course, like you say, capacity isn't always exactly, as we very well know these days, meeting what you need. And you might go to some of these smaller places to find capacity. In Los Angeles, the immediate thing that comes to mind is movie studios, right? Sure, Sony and Warner Brothers and Comcast all have their own lots, but every once in a while they use each other's lots to shoot things because they don't have an available studio to shoot at, right? And I'm sure if you're in insurance or in medicine or any other industry, you can think of an example where like, oh, right, our hospital has its own stuff, but occasionally we contract with someone else or a smaller lab or something for things like that. So that is an interesting aspect of this to keep in mind is it's not monolithic. There's just a lot of installations out there that can be moved around. The other thing I want to hear from you is what's not exactly a day in the life, but what's it like to walk into a data center when you go there? What does it feel like on the inside? If you look at that Google data center website, you see a lot of pipes and industrial looking stuff and server racks and everything. Is that just the impressive looking part of the data center?
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, a data center is a lot like any other industrial facility, like wastewater treatment plant or a processing plant or things like that. There's equipment kind of going everywhere. And it's always a battle between the design engineers and operations, because the design engineers want to package everything in as small a footprint as possible. But that doesn't make it easy to operate and maintain the equipment, because there still has to be space in order to get into, service the circulation fan, or to, access the switchgear. And a lot of times the designers, they have not actually been inside of one of the facilities to see, hey, you put this cable tray in the way of this fan, so once this building is commissioned, nobody's ever going to be able to get up there to fix that fan if it breaks. Now, it turns into operations problem, because you're not just going to leave a broken fan. Somebody's going to have to go up there and fix it, and then it's on the operations people to figure out how to make it happen. So there's a little back and forth in regards to that. But yeah, in many ways, Google makes it, googly, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
So, have the color coded pipes and it's bright and everything like that. Each company kind of has its brand identity. So that's Google's, primary colors and brightly lit and things like that. Switch, that I was just at, in my opinion, they're aiming to kind of be like the Death Star in a lot of ways. You walk in a Switch facility and it's almost like walking in and seeing oh, there's the Kuiper crystals for the super laser.
So not in the sense of blowing up planets, but in the sense of being, sleek and dark.
Right.
And
sleek and dark and kind of imposing,
Because,
you talked about walking into a data center. There's a lot of security, when you go into these facilities, because you're dealing with hundreds of customers' data. You might have government data on some of these servers. Those have their own security requirements. One of the things I found most fascinating when I was at Google was that, the hard drives, you swap them out occasionally when they fail and everything like that. They don't sell them. They don't repurpose them. They have a giant crusher, and it's a disk shredder, and it just pulverizes. They just stick entire hard drives in there, and it just bashes them up into fine little, pieces.
Yeah, so, and that makes sure nobody ever gets whatever data was on there, or makes pretty sure anyway.
Yeah.
So it sounds to me like a data center, from what you're describing and what we've seen in that website, is part factory, part laboratory. But with a lot more computers than you might have in a typical factory that's making widgets or wheels or something like that. Is that fair?
Yeah, I'd say, it's definitely, I think it's more on the factory side. The whole purpose of having a data center is to store data to make money. That's what these companies are for. So they want to have their production infrastructure working as much as possible. Now they might have a couple of rows or a corner of the data center where they have some experimental stuff that they're working on. So yeah, one of my favorite things was when I was at Google. I don't know if this was a long time ago, but do you remember AlphaGo? Where it the first time it beat an actual master at Go. That server was in one of the data centers that I was in, and they put a little plaque on it. This server housed AlphaGo where it beat the first Go master and stuff like that. So that was really cool. But that's not taking up all of the floor space here.
Yeah, and I'm guessing you couldn't. unless you knew which server it was, you might not be able to figure it out immediately.
Oh, absolutely. Because nothing's labeled,
Yeah,
nothing says, oh, Netflix lives on this server.
It doesn't have a big Go board sitting in front
No,
of it.
it doesn't. It was only after that, that the AlphaGo team told us, like, hey, it was server IA 63
Oh, interesting. You didn't even know what
whatever.
was going on.
Yeah, we had no idea.
So let's get to some of the things. And I'm glad we talked about the security of the data, because I think that's probably something people wonder about. And the fact that it is heavily secured for entry, and that there are procedures to make sure that when that hard drive is done, that the data that's on it is no longer accessible to anybody anymore. You only want the data accessible within the data center. Let's start with things that you've heard people say about data centers that you're like, well, that's not exactly how it works. And I don't just mean the things about water consumption and electrical, although I'd like to talk about those as well.
Yeah.
But maybe some other things you've heard that are like, oh yeah, data centers are great at this, and you're like, man, that's not actually what they do.
Yeah. So the biggest misconceptions that I've heard are around power and water usage. If we could start there, I think that would be easiest, because that's kind of the big one. Those are the big topics that I think are hot button issues right now. So in regards to water consumption, I think what a lot of people think of when they think of, like, oh, they're using hundreds of thousands of gallons a day, and that's a big deal, especially here in Vegas. There's
Sure.
The Lake Mead is at historical lows, and water consumption is a big deal. But the type of cooling that uses a lot of water, it's called evaporative cooling. And so you have a big cooling tower, and there's a big fan inside, and it sucks in air, and water sprays in, and basically the latent heat, or I'm sorry, the heat from that water is absorbed, and it's basically exhausted out the top, and then that water is then recirculated into the data center. That is very highly water intensive, and older facilities definitely use evaporative cooling in that way, but so do a lot of other types of industries. So it's not just the data center industry that's using that. Now, in locations where water usage is more of a concern, like here in Vegas, it's much more like a rooftop unit, where it's got a chiller outside, and it's a closed loop system, and it's a lot like, think of a scaled up version of the cooling system on your car, where you have a big radiator and a fan, and it's got water and glycol inside of there as the coolant, and that's what removes the heat from your engine. That's what a lot of these sites use now, is more of a closed loop kind of chiller type cooling system. So you have your initial fill requirements, where you have the deionized water that you initially put into the system to fill it up with your glycol. But then after that, it's a closed loop. So if there, unless something catastrophic happens, like a leak or a pipe failure or something like that, you're actually not using a lot of water. And so that's what a lot of companies and facilities are going towards, because of the water concerns. Because obviously for the communities at large, like, all of this water usage is a big deal, but also water is expensive. And like I said before, like, these are companies who are looking to make a profit. So if they can reduce their costs by reducing water consumption, then that's what they're going to do. So I think that's a big misconception.
Of the ones you've worked at, how many used evaporative versus closed loop?
So the ones that I worked at Google use the evaporative cooling, and that was about 10 years ago or so. The ones that I've been working on more recently, and like in Portland and here, use the more radiator based cooling systems. So
I think it's fair to say that the older the data center, the more likely it might have evaporative cooling. New ones, I don't know that they're 100% using closed loop, but like you said, there are pressures to make them do it. And that's why I said in the previous special I did on data centers, like, that's the thing to ask about. if it's coming to your community and you're concerned about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I'm just trying to arm people with information
Yeah,
here.
yeah.
Because, if, I think, and it goes to credibility, like, and we talked a little bit about this before we started, like, it's important to me to be credible in what I'm talking about. And so that's why I don't say, oh, I'm the end all be all data center expert.
Right.
So I think it's important if you go to your town hall meetings, or you are, even protesting, or talking to somebody who might have influence, it's important to have the correct information for the site that you're in. I think that people have a right to, have informed decisions made for them, and not just have these sites railroaded through. I it's tough because I'm always a see both sides type of person. On the one hand, like, yes, I think we really do need data centers, but on the other hand, I think that the residents should have a right to know what's going on in their communities. And so providing information, if I can, I think is a good thing.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the electrical use, because I think that is the other main concern. And then maybe we can talk a little bit about noise, but let's start with electrical.
Yeah, so most data centers get their electrical power from the local utility grid. So they buy it from whoever the local electrical provider is. Like for here in Vegas, it's NV Energy. It comes in on high voltage power lines, like 13.8 kilovolts, or 145 or 345 kV. Goes into a substation, and then it comes in, goes into a transformer, gets stepped down to the voltage that's needed, then goes in through like switch gear, which is basically a bunch of breakers and different ways to distribute the power to the servers. Almost every single data center these days also has a diesel generator backup, or sometimes natural gas backup power. So kind of in parallel with your utility power coming in, you also have a way to, if that utility power goes away, there's usually some type of diesel generator that will start up and provide power to the critical load until the utility power comes back. And I think the misconception that a lot of people have is that those diesel generators are running 24/7. Now, don't get me wrong, there might be facilities in remote locations where there is no utility power.
And there's one really well-known one that's abusing that. But
but in general, they're for standby backup power. And so they're generally not running all the time. Usually they're run for about 15 minutes once a month, just to make sure that they start up correctly and that all of the equipment still works. And then depending on what company and what site you're at, usually once a quarter or semi-annually, you'll actually put the generator on the bus where it's carrying critical load. So it's actually supplying the power to the data center.
The electrical bus, not the school bus.
Yeah, not a school bus. Yeah. So, and that's just to verify that generator can carry the load that it's supposed to. And that's only, usually only for about an hour or so. Because you want to make sure that this equipment will work when you want it to. So, you can't just leave it sitting there all the time inactive, and then you have a utility outage, and then, oh no, my generator will not start up. And then you just lose everything. That's
it seems to me from what you're saying, in general, data centers have just talked to the local community electrical supplier about getting their electrical, that this idea of data centers coming in and providing for their own electrical or providing money for build out is kind of a newer thing.
Yeah, it is kind of newer. It's, the data centers providing their own power. That's definitely a newer thing. And especially you hear talk about, like, the SMRs, the small modular reactors, nuclear power powering these data centers, so they don't have to, be a strain on the grid, and maybe in some instances, maybe even provide power back to the grid if there's excess generation. I mean, that's a very interesting concept. of course, you run into the NIMBYism that's kind of plagued the nuclear industry its entire, almost its
Yeah, yeah.
entire existence. So, yeah, the it's, there's a lot of situations going on. Like NV Energy has done some questionable things here in Nevada in regards to data centers, especially up in northern Nevada, in the Reno and Lake Tahoe area. That a lot of people are not happy about. Um, so, again, this is one of those things where I think that if you have the knowledge, then when you go to your council meetings or whatever, then you're much more credible because
Yeah.
you've done your research and know what you're talking about.
And I think it's a really interesting point that most people kind of lump water usage and electricity as the two equal concerns. And from where I sit, and tell me if you agree with this statement, water usage is mostly solved. You just have to make sure that the data center being built is using the current technology and not the older evaporative cooling technology. That shouldn't be hard. That's not controversial or new. Electrical is a problem that can be solved, but that's something that is newer and hasn't been tried. And so people are going to make some mistakes in how it's implemented. And so it's a little harder to hold feet to the fire because that's a more difficult problem to solve. Not that it's unsolvable, but that is a newer problem to deal with in providing your own electricity.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And you also have the conflation of, electricity rates are going up across the board. My electrical bill is,
Right.
like, my electric bill is going to be almost $600 this month.
Mm-hmm.
Is that because of data centers? Maybe a small percentage of it is, but I think more of it is that, we're just running our air conditioning a lot more than we did.
Yeah. Or world events, right? That are driving up energy prices for entirely unrelated reasons.
Yeah. So I think it's important to, understand that there is nuance. My electricity bill is not going to be significantly higher because of data centers. And I think that's where a lot of the arguments come from is, no situation is ever just black or white. It's always shades of gray. And I think that's what we're running into here.
What about noise? There's a lot of discussion about data centers being located close to residential areas and residents complaining about the noise from them. As someone who's worked in them, what do you make of that?
So in my experience, yes, the server fans and the cooling fans inside of the facility, they are kind of loud. You do have to wear hearing protection, but I think a lot of that is contained within the facility. For example, the site that I was just at Switch, it's right next to a major highway. So I think that there's more noise for the surrounding, tenant, commercial and residential properties. I think there's more noise from just the highway than there is from the data center. So, again, I think people are pushing the data center bad button when there's other stuff going on.
Yeah. So you haven't heard much about infrasound or any of that sort of stuff?
Yeah, I mean, of course, I've heard about that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know a lot about it. Me personally, my time at the data centers, I was never really affected. But then I know some people are more sensitive to different frequencies and stuff like
Sure.
that. So I can only say that I was not affected.
What about let's move from the things that people have misconceptions about to the things that people might not know at all. The things that you're like, I don't think people realize this about a data center.
Oh, well, so it's
You
kind
might
of
be surprised to learn, so to speak.
yeah. I think that's something that people might be surprised to know, and maybe not, but like you really don't, there's really not a lot of people that you need to operate a data center. And maybe that's more on the negative side. Obviously
Right.
your construction trades and, your commissioning companies and your general contractors are all engaged during the construction and fit out and initial startup of your data center. But then once the data center is operating, there's not really a lot of people that are required to run it. And so, I think that people should be wary when, a company says, oh, we want to build a data center in your town and it's going to bring 2,000 jobs. It's like,
Hmm.
is it really? Like, how many of those people are actually, number one, going to come from the local community versus like, current employees who are going to be brought in? And number two, how many of those people are, how many of those jobs are construction versus
Right.
operations? So,
Yeah, and things that'll go away.
yeah, it really doesn't require a lot of people to operate a data center.
How
Maybe,
many how many do you think for an average size data center?
um, so I would say, so when I was at Google, we actually did a lot of our own maintenance. So we had maybe 30 or 40 facilities engineers who, between electrical, mechanical, HVAC, generators, stuff like that. Um, Other companies or other sites, even within Google, they contracted that work out. So, when I was at the site in Iowa, we were all Googlers and we all did all that work. But other sites like in Oregon or, you know, Atlanta, like they might contract that work out to a third party contractor. And so your actual number of Googlers would actually be smaller
Mhm.
because you wouldn't have those people on payroll. You just bring them in to do specific jobs and things like that. So it depends, even within a company, it depends on how the site is set up with its contracts and everything.
Yeah, and I think the other thing to keep in mind is that when companies are talking about jobs, they could be talking about construction. They could be talking about the 30 to 50 people that might be on site. They also could be talking about the after effects, right? Like if we have this data center, it gives us more capacity to provide more products that will then allow more people to start businesses and employ people. And
Yeah.
that's valid. I think that's a valid stat, but it is important to keep that in mind when a data center says we'll bring this many jobs. Like, okay, great. What
What's
are
the
those jobs?
what's the breakdown of those jobs? Yeah, it's like, you might have, in the middle of nowhere, and then somebody builds a gas station. And then you start having businesses branch.
Yeah,
Oh,
right.
they built a fast food place. Somebody built a Walmart, and then all of a sudden you have a hub, and I don't know if they, take into account those types of jobs, but it's definitely something that I think people should ask.
Have you run into people with, because a lot of what we've talked about so far are the more typical like objections. Have you run into people who think like, oh yeah, data centers can solve this. All I need is a new data center and I can make this happen. And you're like, yeah, I don't know that data centers can do that.
Yeah, and this is just my personal opinion, but a lot of that is the much more higher ups within a company.
Yeah.
They're much more idealistic about that kind of stuff. From who I've run into and everything like that. Most of the people that I worked with, in the operations and commissioning are more like, hey, I mean, this is great. Um, it'll keep the bills paid and everything like that. But I don't really run into a ton of the super idealistic people all the time.
The data center optimist. Is
Yeah,
there is there anything in your day-to-day work, and obviously I don't want you to speak out of school about anything proprietary or that you shouldn't talk about
sure.
for any of the people you've worked at, but are there any examples of things where you ran into an oddity in the way data centers are managed where you're like, we always have to fix this, or this is always an issue, or something like that that gives people a little vignette example of life working inside of one?
Oh, man, that's a tough one. I hadn't prepped for that. I would say that a lot of these data centers are, you have a design, and the design engineers come up with it, and then you kind of think how things are supposed to work.
Yeah, yeah.
But then, once a facility goes into operation, things don't work the way that they thought that they would, and so you have to modify your plans. So like, for example, um, like, yeah, when I was, you might think, okay, we're going to, like, we have this certain switch gear that powers these four, server rows or something like that. And if we need to power down one of the rows, we'll just contact the networking people to like move all the traffic away from a particular row so that we can then shut it down. And it turns out that's a lot harder than you would think, because, and even this was, 10 years ago when I was at Google, you have people processing tasks and they're not easily, movable from one, server row to another server row just because of the processing that's going on. And so, what had to happen was we had to install another set of switchgear that could provide power to that server row while we turned off the stuff that we needed to work on. And
so you're fixing the plane in flight, as they say.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, that's essentially what it was. And nobody had really anticipated needing to be able to do that, because they were like, oh yeah, it'll be easy to drain that row. And then it's like, oh no, like, people have work that they're doing, and you can't just, put in a drain request and expect it to be done very quickly. So,
people are accessing their Google Docs right now on that one.
Cat videos, man. I mean, process that cat video.
How much percentage of any data center is cat videos, do you think?
I don't know off the top of my head, but I always thought it was fun when I was working on a server rack that, hey, this might have a bunch of cat videos on it. Or it was fun to imagine like, oh, this could have some of my Google Docs on it or something.
Yeah.
We never know, like we talked about before, like you have no idea what's on these computers. So it makes it fun to think about like, oh, maybe my Google Photos are on this one.
Or on this very machine that you're working on. Yeah. How do you feel about working at data centers these days? I imagine it's changed over the years. Yeah. Like, how do you personally think about that issue?
It's hard because obviously, data centers are very important. It's cloud infrastructure and this and that. And, in a lot of ways, we have my wife and I have a friend who does IT for one of the big casino companies over here in Vegas. And we talked about this, because on the one hand, yes, it can feel icky sometimes, working for these, big tech companies who, maybe you don't necessarily agree with, the politics of who's in charge or, kind of what the industry is about. But then on the other hand, you got to put food on the table too, and in some ways it's like, well, if I don't do this, somebody else will, and it's a moral conundrum. And, that's one of the reasons why I ended up leaving, the commissioning job that I had. It paid really well, but, I couldn't square the circle anymore with it. It was kind of, it was hard. It was getting to the point where like, I don't feel proud to work on this. And that's my opinion, obviously, I don't speak for everybody, but that was what led me to, among other things, of course, there's always multiple reasons you do a job, but, I think that people who work in and on data centers these days have a real challenge, especially from people who may not, watch shows like Daily Tech News Show and get, unbiased information about things. They just see what they saw on social media and they're like, oh yeah, all data centers bad, blah, blah, blah. It's like, there's always nuance to everything. But, so I ended up making the decision for myself to get out of it. Yeah. But I think it's hard.
Well, before we wrap up, anything else that we missed or you thought about along the way that you want to add to the conversation to help people understand all of this?
I just encourage people to actually look, if you have a data center coming, that they're planning in your community and if you're opposed or if you're for it, either way, like educate yourself on it, because all of the plans are, they have, all of the companies before they build, they have to file for permits. They have to submit the plans to the local jurisdiction for approval. A lot of that stuff is public. And so you can find things and find things out. And if you want to, go to a council meeting, pro or against data centers, it really helps if you have the information. It makes your case a lot stronger than just showing up and saying, I hate data centers or I love data centers.
I hate data.
Yeah, I don't like data. So that I think that's the message that I would really impart on people is like educate yourselves and then make your own decisions. I'm not here to evangelize or demonize the data center industry.
Indeed. Well, Craig, thank you very much for spending so much time chatting with us about your inside experience, which I know you're at pains to make sure people don't think you know more than you do, but I think you do know more than you think you do. And that's really helpful for us to hear your side of things.
Well, I appreciate that, Tom. And, I'm happy to answer any questions, people have.
Yeah. In fact, that's a good reminder. Folks, I'm sure you will have thoughts and say, well, you know what? Actually, I want to know more about this point that Craig made, or I'd like to have him answer a question that we didn't talk about on this particular episode. Craig very kindly has agreed to do a follow-up episode in the future if we get enough of those. So send those questions our way. You can either comment on the Patreon or Substack directly, or send them to us feedback at dailytechnewsshow.com, and we'll keep them squirreled away until we have enough of them to revisit. You can ask a real data center employee a question.
And please don't crucify me. I'm I've done my best to speak in good faith. So.
Yeah, he's here to help. So keep that in mind. Craig, in the meantime, anything to tell people about it? Or is there anything that you have going on you want to let people know about?
Yeah. If you're interested in kind of what's going on in my life, and I have my own website. It's djfission.com, DJFISSION.com, 2 S's. And yeah, that's, if you want to, connect or, LinkedIn or, tell me how terrible I am or how great I am.
No, don't do that.
But yeah, that's actually, so that banner picture, it's actually, I got that picture, when I was in New Jersey, and it's actually the skyline of New York City. But
at the top of your website there, that's real.
That's real. Yeah, it's New York City, right after like sunrise, and I really like it because it looks like if you remember in Mass Effect, it reminded me of like some of the skylines in Mass Effect. So that's
it does not look generated. I'll say that, but it looks artistic. It looks like somebody painted it or created it.
Yeah, I just took that with back then I had a Pixel 6 Pro, and it just it's just a straight photo. I don't, back then I don't think they had a ton of the AI processing that they have now. So it's just a picture that I took.
Well, now you're going to want to go see it, folks. So you have to go to djfission.com. Again, Fission, with 2 S's. To get there. Craig, thank you so much, man. I appreciate you taking the time to chat with us.
Yeah, of course, Tom.
And of course, thank you everybody for supporting us, allowing us to be able to do this at patreon.com/DTNS. If you enjoy this episode, you would like to have more of them, and maybe get them ad-free, support us directly, patreon.com/DTNS. Have a great weekend, everybody. We'll be back with regular episodes on Monday. Talk to you then.
The DTNS family of podcasts, helping each other understand.
Diamond Club hopes you have enjoyed this program.